What's up, guys? Welcome to a new video. My name is Joop from the Clips, aka Macaroni with the Cheese, and today I got a brand new video for you. Today is the 50th of May 2024, and we're gonna do a quick market update, and I have a good video for you this time, and it's gonna be a big subject, so bear with me, guys. Yeah, we still in fear, as in for the fear and greed index. And next week, the week ahead coming, we have earnings season. We are in earnings season, quarter 2 of 2024. So that means the earnings reports are coming out. So the next company are reporting their earnings seasons are the big one, Uber, Shopify, Disney, Palantir on Monday, Twilio on Tuesday, Crocs. Let me see, Robinhood on Wednesday, Toyota, and we got Thursday, we got Marathon, the Bitcoin miner company, Unity, and Friday. Okay, so the big ones that I'm gonna follow is Uber, Shopify, Disney, Crocs, Lyft. So there are a few. The traded desk. So there are a few that I'm gonna follow for next week ahead. So Uber went down because of the whole narrative of Tesla is gonna start early with a robot taxi. So that's pretty much bad news for Uber. You all know Uber is the regulative way of taxis with human based. So that was not good news for Uber. We got Shopify. Shopify is at $74. And I still believe in Shopify, but it has shown me some down momentum. Uber's at 69. So let's see what the price of Disney is. So Disney is currently at $130. So $130. We all have to wait and see. We all know Disney and Tesla CEOs are not the best friends. So we have to wait and see what's gonna happen. A few companies pretty much interesting. Which one? Traded Desk, that I'm pretty much doing my research on. Traded Desk, it's at $88. So it's pretty much interesting to see what's gonna happen with the earnings calls of these companies. We got Airbnb. We all know Airbnb for renting houses and etc. It's $159 per share. So we got a pretty much interesting earning reports ahead of us for coming week, the week of 6 May 2024. Okay, so my next subject, what I want to talk about and where I make this video of is I want to talk about the 5 phase of the life cycle. We got David Murrins, his website. He's pretty much a global forecaster. And what he basically did is he's basically looking at wars and empires and how they have their consolidation and their expansion of a period of time. So what he basically did, he put something together that calls the 5 phases of life, where he talks of the expansion phase and he talks of the contractive phase. So in this video, bear with me, guys, because English is not my main language, it's my third. So try to go hands with me, try to bear with me on these subjects, but I will leave the articles under my YouTube video for you to consider it and to read on. So what he's basically saying, there are 5 phases, like of cycles of empires. A model of growth and decline of civilizations can provide a way both to understand history's big picture and to accurately assess current and the future geopolitical environment. So I'm a guy who basically like to see the bigger picture of things and not the micro things. So what I wanted to share with you is pretty much how we all see that the United States, the big empire of the world, is basically in its contractive phase. So back in the 90s, 70s, and 80s, the United States was pretty much the unipolar world, the number one land world that basically ruled the world with all his money, with the dollarization and everything. But now in the last phase in 2024, we have seen a much of declining of the American power. because of the whole narrative with de-dollarization, but also of printing money. So the 5 phases of the whole five life cycle of empires is, we got regionalization, accession to empire, majority, overextension, and decline and legacy. So these 5 phases is pretty much how he illustrates what's basically going on. So he said these 5 phases can be compared to the human life, beginning with the birth and the period of nurturing, and followed by independence, self-expression, and the manifestation of one's capabilities in the world. A peak is reached after, say, 4 or 5 decades. If it could measure it, it would comprise a mixture of wealth, energy, health, containment, power, and creativity. Finally, decline towers. That begins completing the cycle. So it's a pretty nice metaphor to compare this with how life is comparable with this situation. So yeah, it's interesting to see how he's telling this goes in cohorted. So there are 5 phases in the expansion phase. Is the expansion of territory, influence, risk orientation, growth and development of national infrastructure, social cohesion, national pride, and sense of duty and optimism. And those are the 5 stages of the expansion phase. And the contractive phase is basically strike and spare of influence, professionalism, is emphasis on individual rights, social fragmentation, social discord, and pessimistic. So those are the 6 phases of the contractive phase. So the 6 steps of the contractive phase. So what is always explaining of the 5th stage of this empire is the illusion of status quo gluing to the overextension stage now shatters. The stage of decline and legacy can be described as the evolution of multipolarity. The unipolar would dilute as the hegemon grows feebler and challenging nations. So we all know that back in the 1970s, the United States was pretty much the biggest country in the world who was ruling the world. As we know that China was pretty much not the biggest one. And later in the decade, we all have seen how China is expanding. And pretty much in the next few decades, China could be the #1 unipolar in the world. So that's the moment that we will see that the decline of the power from the United States is going to the Chinese. And that's pretty much the phase that we are in. And that's what he's explaining in the 5th stage of the empire, when basically the power is being shifted from one global power to the next one. And he's saying that the illusion of the status quo gloom during the overextension stage now shatters. Often the catalyst is a key event like attacks on 9/11. The response by the leadership is attempt to more deeply embody the perceived original values of the empire. When their actions fail, a path is open to new leadership, reflecting to the new social order. And often descendants of the former underclass now rising come to power. This process can appear as though hope has been renewed, yet it is in effect the beginning of the end of the empire, near the end of the Western Roman Empire decline. The Germanic chieftain Odoacer, believed to be Goat, became emperor, although the acknowledged alliances, the deposed and permanently exiled Emperor Julius Nepos. The Visigoths and the Vandals had sacked Rome long before, however, and many historians consider Odoacer's reign as marking the Western Emperor's end. So those are key elements and key points in civilization, in this whole narrative that basically happened through a human life, where we can see big developments are happening. And we're currently at the 5th stage of this whole development. So what I was saying is that the great power shift from the west to the east, the great west to each power shift, is best exemplified by the diagram below that combines the path of the 2 super empires, the West Christian super empire and the Asian super empire. It's going and has reached a critical phase which will come to a head cascade in 2025 and 2027 period. So as I was saying, is that there is a global shift from power to power, from the west to the east, and these are a few countries that basically will rising up back to the 1400s and 1500s. The orange line is the Netherlands, where I'm from, and we have seen that the empire, as in that was the period when the Netherlands went. They call it the VOC time-based period, because that was the moment when the Netherlands was pretty much accelerating in their power and pretty much confiscating land and ruling land with a lot of power. And so the white line is the English Empire. We all have to know that the English Empire is the biggest one. Is also the cousin of the United States. But the United States basically took over that power back in the 1800s or 1900, if I can see this. But so the greatest empire was the English Empire, the Great Britain Empire, and we also see that of the wealth that they have. But now we all see that in this period of time, we see that it's shifting. So it's shifting from the west to the east, and the last period where it is where we have seen that currently at the moment we have seen that a lot of this power is being shifted to the east, to the Asia. And yeah, it's pretty interesting to see how this develops. So this chart is telling how the US debt burden as a function of its empire. So we people, there are two sort of people. We have people that operate on the left side of the brain, and we also have people that operate on the right side of the brain. We call those linear, and we call those lateral. So people who operate on the right side are creative and always can see a problem being solved on different perspective. But the people who operate on the left side of the brain, they always operate on a linear way. So that's also correlates with how the world operates. So 70% of most people are pretty much linear. Those are the 9-to-5 people. Those are the mid-class people, and those are the people who are creating a lot of production for society. And the people who are in position, so the people are basically made the decision and who are creative and developing themselves, those are the lateral people. So that's pretty much what we have seen, is that because of the money printing we have seen lately in the United States, we have seen how the money printing pretty much have accelerated the way of people are thinking. So it's pretty much rebalanced the shifting of the 70% of linear people. It pretty much accelerated those amount of people going much higher. So how systems going to be more linear and less lateral. And this chart will basically tell you how in each phase there are significant key events that happening in the whole the 5 phases of the life cycle. So the Civil War was in 1860, and then we had the Great Depression War, World War I in 1910, the World War I in 1940. And it basically is how you see we basically were in power, and then we're now in decline with the Gulf War, the Afghan War in 2001. And now we all see how everything is declining. So I always said we have to see the United States as the Roman Empire. And yeah, we pretty much are declining. The United States is pretty much declining. So so there's a comparison here between the Roman Empire and the Western Empire. As you can see, it pretty much expands. And the Roman Empire was the original example of the super empire phenomenon would become the Western Empire after 50th century and began, as we have seen, in the 8th century. Because so here, and the yellow one is the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, and you see how those two periods where it expands, everything is great, possible, and then it comes down, and here the next one is taken over. So it's pretty much interesting to see how this thing's working. And this one is the one of Netherlands that I was telling you about. So the green one is Portugal. We all know Portugal in around the 1400s was pretty much great, accelerating with the whole legacy. And then the orange line is the Dutch. We had a pretty much good run from the 1400s all the way to the 1700s. The white one is the English Empire. It started between 1400 and 1500. It went all the way up to the 1800, 1870. And then it came back here around 2001. And we could see how the Great Britain are very impactful. They had a great history, a legacy, but they're pretty much done. It's pretty much done. And the last one left is the United States Empire. Even Germany, Germany had its own right, and that's the dark green. It started in the 1800s. It accelerates to the 1870s, and then it went down and went back up again. So it's pretty much interesting to see how the developments are going. So instead of continuing with this explanation, I will show the video of David Murrin, how he explaining the 5 stages of empire with more context, and yeah, it's basically his theory. So who's better to explain you the theory of the guys of his own, the person who basically managed and put this thing together. So without further ado, I hope you learned something, and we'll continue to see this video and how this all will influence on your stocks and commodities, gold, and etc. So let's start.
5 stages of empire is basically this idea that humans self-order themselves into regionalization, ascending to empire, maturity, overextension, and decline. And they're linear in this function. They go through a civil war and lateralize. They algorithmically expand through this process. They reach maturity. They start to throw out their lateral thinkers and replace them with more linear, large institutional governance. They roll over the top. They lose adaptation, but they're still a huge monopoly, so they seem unchallenged. They suffer a major reverse and they collapse. Now, back in 2002, when I formulated this idea and I started to speak about it, of course, this was just, there wasn't anything like it. There have since been some people that have similarly followed these ideas because they received books I sent them, but we won't talk about that. There's an awful lot of details on the site you can read. But what I really want to describe to you is human societies create periods of coherence, which I call anti-entropy. They peak and then they create loss of coherence and they become entropic. And each one of these cycles is depicted by a type of conflict, because not all wars are similar. There are various types: wars of expansion, wars of contraction, civil wars. They all have a different character which marks them on that cycle. And indeed, I study every empire in history, and they all did similar things, irrespective of technology. But there was one problem, and that was Western civilizations had shorter duration. I didn't really understand why that could be until I realized that, in fact, they were the pistons of a bigger system. And what the West really was, or the Western Christian world as we know it, is a super system comprising of nations, from the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Dutch, the French, the British, which, I hate to say this to our American cousins, was the greatest empire we've ever seen in terms of pure outright power and control. America over here, and Germany tried twice, once as a Christian empire and then as an atheist empire to challenge. And in fact, our peak of this Western Christian world was the onset of the First World War. The Second World War was part 2, and they started to decline. And this period of the Cold War is in fact taking place in the declining period of this super Western Christian empire. And America was without doubt the last of the Western Christian empires. And I concluded that 9/11 in fact was the beginning of its decline. Of course, a lot of people, when I went on television and talked about what it represented, laughed at me. Today, less so. In fact, the track of the past 20 years has been frighteningly along the lines of the discussion of what decline looked like. And we're talking about a shift to the importance of self over collective, talking about increased narcissism, contraction of the idea that the borders of empire are no longer recognized and they're allowed to be frayed and impinged upon. Every single quality of decline we've seen in the American Western system. But that system is also matched by another system. And that other system is what I call the Super Asian Empire, which started with Japan's challenge, and China is the second challenge, and India is the third coming up behind it. China has been reorganizing itself on its own empire cycle, it's not included here, since the Boxer Revolution. Its end of regionalization was the end of the Civil War, and yet it couldn't expand to empire because of the American glass ceiling. And that glass ceiling basically meant right the way up until the third Taiwan Straits crisis, it couldn't move. It couldn't get out of its box, and it was becoming older and less energetic. So he came up with a great strategy to befuddle the West, to get it to invest in its manufacturing base, to deindustrialize the rest of the world, subvert an open society, looking like they would be capitalist, and then use those mechanisms to build the biggest arms industry in the world and come back and run us over. And we are now at the day of reckoning, having gone over there for our own greed, our own incentives for higher productivity and low inflation. We got suckered, we got greedy, and we're now paying a massive price. This represents this intersection, an intersection of when decline of the West intersects with the rise of the East. We all know the center of gravity has moved east, but we really don't like to accept the way that human systems work is that's usually concluded with a war which turns voluntary migration of power into a forced migration. And again, when is that moment? Where are we? Now, the reason why I decided to take the path I did was because when I first started to think about investing in commodities in 2000, I followed and had already been following the work of Kondratiev, which is a 56-year commodity cycle. And as this says here, human beings only fight over resources. Fundamentally, that's what we fight over. We use religious memes and differences in thoughts and organization, but we want more resources to grow our system from another, period. Now, Kondratiev noted that there's it's the wrong way around, sorry. There is, in effect, a 54-year cycle, and that 4 to 6 year cycle resulted in peaks of conflict. Now, once I identified the beginning of the cycle in 2000, and we were really successful buying Lucol at 64 cents, selling for $64, buying gold and gold shares. We built an agricultural agglomerate with Harvard in Africa, which is the biggest of its kind, all based on this cycle. But what really worried me was if this cycle started, it would end. And it would end somewhere around 2030, and usually conflicts start up to 8 to 10 years before the peak. So we would be in a global conflict somewhere from 22 onwards. And that is what really drove me to start to overcome my dyslexia and write books. This drumbeat is really important because it's like a drumbeat that regulates the rate of change. And every 112 years, it triggers major hegemonic conflicts. If you'll notice that this one here, the American Civil War, is not a major one. The major one is the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, which was Germany's challenge to Britain, and the Asian challenge of China to basically democracy. These wars here, much as they appear to be big, are regional wars in between. So this 112-year hegemonic cycle is profound, and it really has dominated my thinking for 20 years since I found it. And I call it the drumbeat of wars, the drumbeat of civilization. And strange enough, when you go back, it's the regulation of when these swap over points take place. Now, we'll look at them in some detail, but it's interesting to watch. Now, so how would you know about this? Well, you'd know about it from the theory on my site. And for those of you that follow my CIO's view, we created warnings, which are from the beginning of the year, that geopolitical pressures were really going to build this year. And sure enough, that's an example of what you would have received. And that we were also, unlike the central banks, about to receive a massive inflationary pulse. Because, as we'll talk about, inflation is not just about domestic dynamics. There's something else that happens. Because this cycle that basically is the Kondratiev cycle is a measure of inflation. It's a measure of inflammation in the system and what I describe as anti-entropy, which ultimately results in conflict and polarization, or polarization and conflict in the correct orders. So what does that look like in terms of our terms? Well, this is a Kondratiev cycle over the Cold War. And you can model the Cold War as the Russian system is a commodity producing society, the USSR, and the Western system was a consumer. And it moved into the 75 peak. And in fact, if you look at the Cold War, somewhere around 75, the USSR looked unstoppable. And capitalism was really looking very creaky. In fact, America was at the top of its cycle as an empire, and it still suffered with roughly 15% CPI, 15% 10 years, and 22% Fed funds. And then we went through this downward cycle, and the USSR obviously went bust because it couldn't produce and had huge fixed standing costs with its army. And then something happened around 2000. When this cycle should have started over here, we exported all of our inflation to China. And through central bank actions, we suppressed inflation. in a way that's really quite anomalous. And we'll come on to what that manipulation really meant. But the surge we got from 2020 is the beginning of a surge which is going to take us to new highs above this previous peak before 2030. And what's really important to understand, the thing that is out of control of the central banks is resource conflict constriction. So resources are going to be constricted, and it means the central banks lose all control over what they think of as their idea of controlling an economy. And we're into this phase, and we're into a massive catch-up. Now, what does that look like in real terms? Because it's nice to talk about inflation. I love this oil chart because this oil chart since 2000 shows exactly how a contractive cycle works. It basically has the A wave, which we captured in all our work at Emergent, whether it was in agriculture or assets. It then goes through 10 years of deflationary cycle. And that deflationary cycle was 2010 to 20. And that 20 low just after the pandemic into the war in Russia, this whole period here is not this. It is the beginning of something which I believe the evidence is very strongly going to take us to 250 to 300 and within 6 years. And this bit that we're in now is the super dynamic part. And I think the Straits of Hormuz are going to be closed sooner than we think. So what do you do with your money? Well, we've been advocating for a while back now, since this low here in gold, basically the precious metals were the place to be. This was basically how you would have received recent updates on it in your CIO's view. And I think gold is ultimately going to 10,000. We've been long of it since the low. We were long of it from here to here. We caught the correction. It's been an incredibly huge alpha producer. But more importantly, I think it's one of the few places, until government somewhere up here start expropriating from its people to fund the war effort, where you'll be safe. Bitcoin is, in fact, another safe haven. And this one is beautiful in that it's just pure raw psychology. And as raw psychology, we were able to get all sorts of things from this rally to here, this drop, this rally, this drop, the whole lot from buying down here and now being long in this process. Our targets are 96 to 120, and this period here is a consolidation period. So don't think of it, though, as good as gold, because it's not. It's basically a substitute of a time, because there's plenty of evidence that quantum computers are coming, and even more evidence that they may have arrived, and a quantum computer will rip apart a blockchain, and somewhere along the line it will become disruptive. So this is more like a short-term opportunity, not a long-term safe haven. Now, in terms of bond markets, I think we are in a very, very challenging time, and I wouldn't touch a bond for love nor money. In fact, it's one of our core short positions. We've been short right the way from the turning point of about a year and a half ago, ran and traded that area. These yield moves are just going to keep going. And the printing of money coupled with inflation and the increased demand from what I believe is a war economy, which is coming to hit us like a freight train, means that we've got a major problem with funding ourselves through this conflict. This was the end of World War II for America. $300 billion worth of funding took its debt to GDP to this peak. Being the monopoly paid it off, moving into overextension and moving into decline, well, we all know. The only thing the central bank can do, and the only thing it does do in America, is facilitate money printing. The rest is words. It doesn't have any other choice now, at like 40 times leveraged of the underlying economy, to do anything but print. But the question is what happens with that printed money, and that's what's going to change market dynamics. So the key message from this is we are in trouble, inflation is coming down the track, yields are going to go through the roof, and you don't want bond exposure, and you don't want variable interest rates. Do not believe any of this delusional mindset that rates are going to come down. They're not.
So I've been telling you guys how gold is probably go up. It's now around 2,500. So let's see for exactly how much gold is. Gold is currently at, let me see, 2,300. And he's basically saying that he thinks that gold will go up to the 10,000. He's also saying that how money printing is basically the face of when this whole empire will collapse. And the only thing that the United States can do is continue with this money printing. The United States basically doesn't have a great export because they have a big import, so they have to buy a lot from those Chinese, etc. but they have nothing to rebalance that import. So it's pretty interesting how David Murrin is explaining how these wars and how these key events in life are occurring. So it's pretty interesting also to know when you are trading and when you are investing in those commodities, stocks, and etc. You have to know what the bigger picture is in the world. You have to know what's happening, and we all see it in the current activities in the Middle East, the whole Ukraine, Russia. So I will continue with this video and hope to give you more perspective on how David Murrin is seeing what's happening in the world. But I hope you still like this video and like it to be very interesting. So we'll continue.
So what about this magnificent equity market? Well, how does this equity market correlate to American decline? I hear some people say. Well, in this particular CIO's view, we call the peak in the Magnificent Seven and the peak in the current stock market index. This whole move here is not real. Find me an economist who can tell me what America's real unleveraged growth rate is, and they can't.
I've been saying this, guys, and I've been saying just because of the money printing, the whole stock market is basically just flying with a not substantial, very large of export. They have probably good products, but the underlying backbone of the economy is basically established on money printing. So we all have to see the bigger picture, because there will be a crash with the whole system, because how the system is currently operating on the whole money printing thing is not good. With the whole currently numbers of $35 trillion in debt, and still be possible to give countries like Ukraine 60 billion or 30 billion to Israel. But let's continue.
And I would guess it's probably about 0.1%. What's happened is we've been using leverage to compensate for lack of adaptation and productivity. So from 2000, basically 3 times leveraged, 2008, 8 times leveraged, bottom of the cycle where we had the pandemic, 40 times leveraged. Now this is hot air. It's made a few people with assets wealthy, and the same process of money printing has left the core of the American public becoming increasingly poorer as inflation grips their non-asset based portfolios. But what I think is going to happen is we're going to see, and we are on the cusp of the most enormous bear market. None of the 7, barring 1 or 2, are in a bull mode anymore. So this is the turning point. I think we've seen the high of the year, and I think it's going to get very ugly.
He's saying that because of the whole money printing, a lot of stocks went up, but the biggest stocks are the Magnificent Seven. Those are the Teslas, the Google, the Microsoft, Nvidia, and Tesla. But we all seen that those stocks are basically have reached their peak. They were basically pulling the whole stock market up. But because of the 7 companies that the Magnificent Seven have reached their peak, it basically means that there's no expansion anymore. They basically topped out, and they will come down at a moment. So that's basically what he's saying. And what I always want to expand on is that because of the whole money printing system, we have seen that the affordance of life, the cost of living in the United States is basically not affordable. The period where we used to live, like the 1970s and the 80s, where the dollar was pretty strong, the economy was strong. We still have a strong economy, but it's basically based on debt. But so we have seen young people like the Generation Z, so the not the baby boomers, but guys with the age of myself, 30, 40 years old, are basically living in the United States and can afford housing, and it's getting preposterous, guys. So let's continue what David Murrin has to say.
Those of you that don't know what this is the Russell 2000. This is the real story in the American economy. This is the peak, which if you go back is this peak, right? You'll notice that the correction in the Russell has been flat. It's 2,000 companies, and they are incredibly vulnerable to interest rates, and now it's rolling over. So Russell 2000, think of it as the real America, not the NASDAQ, the dollar. One of my studies, which is pretty extensive to those that can read up my CIO's view, is what happened to asset bases into World War I and World War II. And one of the things that happens is hegemonic currencies like sterling suffer. So I think the dollar is not safe. It's not a safe haven. It's basically a currency linked to an empire that basically extracted value through dollarization. And the boundaries of the empire have been contracting. And like all systems that mature, they only get marginal gains from marginal differences, which have all been removed. This is one of my favorite charts. It's sterling. And I think sterling's going to 170. Not because Sunak's brilliant, not because we have great leadership, but because it's actually less of a liability than an empire that's losing control. And it's one of the few alternatives outside the yen, which has got a problem because it's next to China and Europe, and it's better than Europe. So I think sterling, strange enough, is a safe haven, and that we will at some stage get a break up above those parallel lines and see some pretty impulsive action. So as a little side view, one of the things that I have would describe, if I asked you all a question, why does money printing do so much damage to an economy? It does it because of this balance. And this balance in our society is, I believe, 70% of people tend to think linearly and 30% laterally. And the lateral people, on average, when you look at the evidence, were the driving engine towards expansive systems. And if you look at, on average, how systems decline, they decline because they became linear, institutional, and non-adaptive. And so what money printing has done is accelerated that, because for 20 years, the Western world has become less productive in real terms and less adaptive. And it's been able to be run by large, institutionally thinking, linear thinking people, which have ejected their maverick lateral agencies, which are where adaptation comes from. So money printing has created extreme linearization in the Western world. And that is one of the reasons why our leadership and our bodies that lead not just governments but corporate entities cannot see the danger coming in terms of this axis of autocracy that's been chipping away and now moving very aggressively towards us. And we are in a state of war, but we won't admit to it. And that's compounded also by what happens at the end of periods of Pax Britannia, 1914, no one could believe a world war would happen. And at the end of Pax America, again, we've had a period of sustained global peace, and we don't want to believe that this is now the next phase of global war. The two things go together, and they're added by a third thing, which was when markets rally, there's a lot of evidence that it creates collective dopamine in human societies, and the cortisol just can't turn on to see the threat, which is a huge end goal. So we need to lateralize, and we need to basically find new ways to bring lateral people to the fore so we can make adaptations. And I speak to our one-star generals before they take command, and there's often Americans and Ukrainians. When I talk about this concept that war is actually part of our social evolution to lateralize societies and force them to become more creative to survive, which then subsequently after war creates a surge of productivity and creation, and I talk about it and I split the group into lateral and linear thinkers by a certain number of hallmarks. Of course, the linear people don't want to accept this. And last year, I asked the Ukrainian officers, how many lateral linear thinkers are left in command of your forces? And they just nodded their head to say none, because they'd lost their troops, they'd done predictable things, and they didn't survive. So in Ukraine, the reason why Ukraine is surviving is because it's fully lateralized its armed forces. And one of the things that on the brink of war that I would advocate is that basically we lateralize voluntarily rather than by contact with the enemy to increase our capabilities. And I've worked with some of our service organizations to do that. And the outcomes have been really amazing. I think it could be done with hedge funds, it can be done with banks, it can be done with any organization if you start to bring people and make people aware of how different people think and how you can work symbiotically together, which is what I call adaptation and a new lateral linear balance. And there's a lot of stuff on the website which is about how to build. You know, we talk about diversity. There is only one form of important diversity, in my opinion, in terms of how we socially create our human constructs, and that is the balance between linear and lateral thinking and how we work symbiotically together. And my work is designed to help my client base in various ways. And I would describe it in twofold. I think there are many lateral people out there that basically have been ejected from society in some shape or form, find themselves in a blatant clear field, looking at rabbit holes and disappearing down every one. I didn't expect, when I created Global Forecaster, which is a combination of lateral thinking and linear discipline, to actually have to help so often the lateral people discern what is real and what isn't, you know, what they should look at and what they shouldn't look at. And on the other side, I didn't expect to be coping with super linear thinking and organizations that had no lateral element whatsoever. So I really advocate this process of bringing the two ways together to see things in a way that's symbiotic and effective. But it does need both parties to be open-minded. Although I'd say lateral people tend to be more open-minded today, just more paranoid, and linear people tend to be closed-minded, and just completely blind to any alternative outside the railway tracks. I think Mr. Sunak and Biden are perfect examples of that particular danger of thinking.
So guys, I hope you learned something today about the whole linear and lateral way of thinking, because we all see that back in society. I hope you learned something that the United States, aka the Roman Empire, is not in its prime. It's pretty much in his decline of his legacy. And we pretty much see that the whole de-dollarization is running, and they are not a unipolar world anymore, but they're heading back to a multipolar world. Otherwise, they don't want to admit it. And we still see their proxy wars as going on, but we pretty much are in decline, as David Murrins is saying. So you can see this information on his website, davidmurrin.co.uk. I will post a link under the subscription. I hope you learned something today to see what basically happening in the world and how it can affect the way of trading. And yeah, we all have to see what's happening, and we all have to see what the developments are bringing us today. But as he was telling us, is that the NASDAQ is basically not the real world, and the real world is basically the Russell. So if you compare those two charts together and you put the one next to, you will see that there's pretty much a big difference how these two worlds are running. So I want you guys to do your own due diligence. Nothing on my YouTube channel is financial advice, and I hope this will bring you more perspective on how you see things on the world. And I hope you learned something today, and I will see you guys in the next video. And I pretty enjoyed this subject, and I wanted to share this with you guys to continue develop your own on the financial base, but also on the spiritual base and how the world is running around of us. So with that being said, I will close this video. Hope you learned something today, and guys, I will see you in the next video. We out. Peace.